What is cinema if not a grand, mega-budget act of tricking the audience, of making them suspend their disbelief and simply accept the reality with which they're presented with on screen? When that full immersive effect kicks in, there's nothing better. And while there are many typical tricks filmmakers employ to get viewers' defenses down, sometimes they have to think way outside the box to make it happen. Filmmaking is, above all else, the art of problem solving, and these filmmakers all proved they had the nous to come up with mesmerizingly creative solutions to the issues they fought with on set. Let's get stuck into it, shall we? I'm Ewan, you're watching Whatculture, and here are more bizarre ways directors tricked audiences. Children in spacesuits made the space jockey look bigger. Alien. One of the easiest ways to cheat scale in a movie? Just use children. That's precisely what Ridley Scott did in his masterpiece Alien, when he wanted to convey the awe-inspiring scale of the space jockey discovered by the crew of the Nostromo. Rather than build a large model comparable to the movie's adult cast, Scott had his two young sons, and also the son of cinematographer Derek Van Lint, work as stand-ins wearing smaller spacesuits, as was surely both the cheaper and easier option. And you'd certainly never guess it from the end result. The sense of scale is manipulated quite perfectly with smart use of camera perspective, in turn leaving us all mesmerized by the space jockey's gigantic skeleton. Snow White's echoey singing was re-recorded in a toilet. Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. The first song featured in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs is undeniably one of its most memorable and iconic, with Adriana Casalotti's eponymous character belting out "I'm wishing" above a wishing well, where many of her sung lines are echoed back to her. If you assume that the sound team behind the movie either simply had Casalotti record her lines in an echoey environment, or even edited them in post-production to give off the appropriate reverb, neither is actually true. Hilariously, the sound team were struggling to create an appropriate echo, and so resorted to taking Casalotti's vocal recordings into a bathroom, playing them through a speaker, and then recording the resounding echo, allowing them to create the famous call and response within the well. This unorthodox sound recording technique is best known today as worldizing, a term coined by legendary sound designer Walter Murch to describe re-recording existing sounds in a sonically appropriate place to make them feel more real and lived in. Jar Jar Binks' hand was practical for one shot only. Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace. Here we're going, some Phantom Menace content to make this list appropriately Ewan branded. There are very few shots in Star Wars Episode 1, The Phantom Menace that don't contain some measure of CGI, and where Jar Jar Binks is concerned, it's fair to assume that every single glimpse of him is entirely digital, right? Well, not quite. There's a single shot you almost certainly never noticed where a practical Jar Jar is featured when he gets his hand stuck in one of the engines on Anakin's pod racer. My tongue is lava. Cinema. This was achieved by simply having Ahmed Best, who also provided the visual reference for Jar Jar on set, complete with a costume, act out the motion with the practical Jar Jar sleeve worn over his arm. While George Lucas clearly could have just rendered the shot digitally, he probably saved the production a few $1,000 by having Best do it the old-fashioned way. And though it would have been easy for the practical on-set arm to stick out like a sore thumb, it actually blends impressively well into the scene. Tom Cruise walked through a rear-projected New York City on a treadmill, eyes wide shut. Rear projection is a classic Hollywood trick that I really love, and it's kind of sort of come back into fashion as of late, albeit in a highly advanced form, with so many major productions now using LED walls in favor of conventional green screen. Rear projection has typically been used to place actors in environments that weren't logistically feasible, too dangerous for the talent, or that don't actually exist. But in the case of Stanley Kubrick's masterful final film, Eyes Wide Shut, the notoriously exacting filmmaker used the technology to put Tom Cruise on the streets of New York City. Due to Kubrick's fear of flying, the entire movie was shot in England, with London doubling for the Big Apple. But for the scenes where London simply would not pass muster, such as when Cruise's protagonist, Dr. Bill Harford, walks down a street in New York, rear projection was used instead. Incredibly, behind-the-scenes images show Cruise standing on what's effectively a treadmill as footage of the street is projected behind him. Because Kubrick lit Cruise incredibly well, the end result is startlingly impressive, enough that most would surely never realize that Cruise didn't in fact shoot the scene in New York itself. The movies. Tilt-shift photography made objects appear miniature. Game night. Game Night is a rare studio comedy with a keen visual sensibility, as it's perhaps best exemplified by the inspired use of establishing shots that depict the film's central neighborhood as though it resembles toy pieces on a game board. This wasn't achieved by creating an actual miniature of the town where the story takes place, but rather by employing tilt-shift photography. This is a technique by which a camera lens's plane of focus can be shifted and, yes, tilted beyond what we typically expect to see produced on a camera sensor. And so, it allows photographers to make large objects appear miniature by narrowing the depth of field, as you would expect to see on a picture of an actual small object. This can be done both in camera or in post-production digitally, but in the case of this movie, the filmmakers did it for real, using a tilt-shift lens to capture the startling images. Buzzing bee sound effects were included to induce anxiety. The Exorcist. In addition to genuinely terrorizing his cast while shooting The Exorcist, director William Friedkin deployed some uniquely oddball tactics to keep audiences uncomfortable and on their toes. Beyond flashing up subliminal images throughout the horror classic, he also toyed around with viscerally unnerving sound effects to unconsciously unnerve the viewer. Case in point, many of the movie's earlier scenes feature the sound of buzzing bees subtly layered into the soundscape, which activates a primal fear in the audience's lizard brain. Buzz. Am I getting to you all yet? Friedkin also included quote-unquote disturbing industrial sounds during the demon sequences to try and trigger a fight or flight response in those watching by making them anticipate coming danger. Truly one of our greatest all-timers. Actual bowel movements were secretly recorded in a truck stop. Harold and Kumar go to White Castle. Ooh, well, nobody who's seen Harold and Kumar go to White Castle will ever forget the infamous battle scene, where two twin sisters, Clarissa and Chrissy, are shown competitively evacuating their bowels because that's the movie. Beyond the expectation-defying hilarity of these two prim and proper ladies taking some gnarly dumps, what really makes the scene is the evocative sound design, which, if nothing else, delivers some poop splat sound effects so authentic sounding you can practically smell it coming through the screen. And the reason for that? They're actual sounds of people going to the toilet. Oh dear. In a featurette on the DVD entitled Art of the Fart, oh god no, the film's sound engineer Jeff Kushner reveals that after struggling to find existing recordings fit for his purpose, he went out into the field and just secretly recorded actual bowel movement sounds from a truck stop. And this, folks, this is why you don't go and poop in a public toilet. You never know when that rascally Jeff Kushner might be around the corner. Now, obviously, on a serious note, this represents a massive legal and ethical minefield for any film production, unless Kushner secured release signatures from the quote-unquote participants, and certainly isn't something a major Hollywood movie would get away with today. But alas, it was a different time, and the guys were just out there recording people's poops. Chocolate syrup was substituted for blood. Psycho. Though it's generally accepted that Alfred Hitchcock shot Psycho on black and white film primarily for budgetary reasons, it's also been suggested that his decision may have been influenced by the film's content, namely that the iconic shower scene might have been too much for audiences of the day in color. All the same, the monochromatic film stock required Hitchcock and his crew to think differently about how scenes were staged and shot. Most of all, the shower scene in which Marion Crane, Janet Leigh, is shockingly off. Traditionally, the Hollywood recipe for blood consists of corn syrup and red food coloring. It's a tried and true formula for realistic looking blood that also looks great on camera. But that recipe didn't look quite so good in black and white film, and so to produce blood which popped and contrasted with the sheer white of the porcelain bathtub, Hitchcock opted for Hershey's chocolate syrup instead. With its darkness of color and viscosity, it was a perfect substitute, and audiences largely remained none the wiser. Really cool example of how different it is shooting a film with black and white as opposed to color in the air. The final scene used little people and a cardboard plane. Casablanca. If you thought that Ridley Scott using children as stand-ins for adults in Alien was bold, it's got nothing on Casablanca, which almost 40 years earlier dared to toy with scale during its single most iconic and important scene. At the very end of the movie, when Rick, Humphrey Bogart, makes Ilsa, Ingrid Bergman, board the plane to Lisbon, there's an extremely impressive magic trick going on in plain sight. While the scene appears to have been shot at a natural airport, that's not quite the case. It was instead filmed on a soundstage, with the plane in the background being a mere cardboard facade due to space limitations inside the studio. And so, to sell the scale of the plane as being further away from Rick and Ilsa than it actually was, director Michael Curtis hired a group of little people to portray the flight engineers tending to the plane.